Well, I'll go ahead and start. Hi, my name is Quazi, and I teach in the Department of English and Languages. I'm a professor of English. And today I'm going to talk about, the first slide there is good, Cowboys and Indians implementing a pedagogy of resemblances in my classical lit courses here at Tarleton State. There's a long history of mistaking one people for another, especially in the United States. The first one that comes to my mind, for many students also, who first learn about American history, is that supposedly Christopher Columbus was looking for a quicker route to the resources, plunder, and spices of Asia, known as the Indies, but bumped into the people of the New World, a new world that had been inhabited for many thousands of years. The world wasn't new to them, having discovered people in the Bahamas, which Columbus called the West Indies. That still nags the American English lexicon. Indians as a reference to the indigenous peoples of North and South America. This paper specifically relates to the peoples of the land where I and you all teach, in North Central Texas in the United States of America. Those indigenous people are primarily the Comanche, but also include tribes such as Caddo, Waco, Apache, Choctaw, Cherokee, and many others. Growing up, these people were known to me as American Indians. But Indians weren't Indian. My father was born in the real India. Slide 4. Maybe you've heard the simplistic dot versus feather distinction of what someone means when they say Indian. Of course, we've all heard of in this region, especially of the Texas Rangers, of the Lone Ranger and Tonto and his horse in the background, Silver. Furthermore, the course designation for Tarleton State University's Western Lit isn't a reference to the genre of the Western with gunfights, horses, and cowboys riding off into the sunset. But there are romantic heroes that ride off into the sunset and cowboys who are known for their horse prowess and fights that are just as legendary as the one at the OK Corral. Its cowboys wear helmets with horsehair plumes and can run like barn sour stallions. Next slide. It's the first day of class in my Backgrounds of Western Lit course, which is actually Tarleton's version of a classical literature course. Next slide. You know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Bible, Plato's Apology of Socrates, the Republic, Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. As I introduce the course's subject matter and schedule, more than a few times a student will have raised his hand, this is primarily a male-centric action, and say, so we're not reading any Westerns? They're thinking Zane Grey, Larry McMurtry, Louis L'Amour, those kinds of books. So, no, I have to gently comfort them. This course is about a different kind of Western culture. So how do I connect with people who are deeply disappointed that they're not reading Lonesome Dove, but instead Aristotle's Poetics or Ovid's Metamorphoses? Even more daunting, how do I introduce stories by authors like Salman Rushdie to my students, many of whom have never traveled beyond a 50-mile radius of Stephenville, Texas? Next slide. Also known as the cowboy capital of the world. And, next slide, and birthplace of the father of Western swing, Milton Brown, where Tarleton State, of course, is located here in Stephenville. One way I do it is to use what I call, slide, a pedagogy of resemblance, where I steer, see what I did there, my Texas-based rural students away from their misunderstanding of what the course's Western is in Western literature. I do two main things. One is more global and the other is more local. As for a broader example, next slide, please. I like to use Salman Rushdie's film commentary about the 1939 film The Wizard of Oz. It's a BFI Film Classics from 1992. And this is the later second edition. But what he does is you can see how thin it is. Oh, and it's replete with lots of big pages with photos of from the film. And it's just a wonderful commentary, but also resource that does an eclectic approach to a film using lots of theories. And then at the very end of the story or the book, he includes a short story that he himself has written called "At the Auction of the Ruby Slippers." And it's sort of you get a taste of his application of theory in a nonfiction way, and then you get a little taste of one of his very, very short stories, which was later also included in a collection called East West. I used this book to shed light on American culture and literary approaches. In that book, which is only 65 pages, Rushdie relates his own experience to Dorothy's and reveals a kaleidoscope of critical approaches as he comments on the film and its significance in modern popular culture. In a short, accessible prose style, Rushdie breaks down plot points, addresses, behind the scenes stories of the film's creation, and illustrates his points with lots of pictures. Slide 12. It's a book that students, especially in the atmosphere of Greg, I knew there was a piece of hair on my, I kept on seeing this Godzilla coming after me. It was actually a little piece of my hair. But it's a book that students, especially in the atmosphere of Gregory Maguire's Wicked and its subsequent film adaptations, Wicked Part 1 and in 2024 and Wicked for Good 2025. At the end of Rushdie's film commentary, as I mentioned, he includes a short story, At the Auction of the Ruby Slippers. And then that was actually included 2 years later in East West. So my more local employment of the pedagogy of resemblance, with a view to translating the ancient world to his students, is to take references and images from Homer and Virgil, particularly those associated with horses. Next slide. To connect those storylines and the concerns therein to my contemporary rural Texas audience. Homer uses this strategy famously with his use of the literary convention of the simile, lining the unfamiliar up with the familiar, using like or as in conjunction with then or so, to compare something less familiar to something more familiar or relatable. Here I just have a slide which is, I think it's Hector being dragged, I think, by Achilles. But usually the the slide would be just mainly pointing out that there's these horsehair crests that are on the helmet, and it's a horsehair crest. All right, next slide, please. And so I mentioned the light. Now, I didn't know this until I really started teaching the whole Homeric simile, but a lot of times it's not just, you've all heard the simile is a comparison using like or as, but what most students don't know, and most people don't know who don't really ever look at these, is that it's always paired up with then or so. So it's like da 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 da, then so da 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 da, or as da 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 da, so da da da. And so it's a very neat little thing that happens. And so we can see, here's a quote from book 20 of the Odyssey. Odysseus is seething about the suitors who have been so forward with his wife while he was returning home from the Trojan War. Homer writes, but he himself kept tossing, turning, intent as a cook before some white-hot blazing fire, who rolls his sizzling sausage back and forth, packed with fat and blood, keen to broil it quickly, tossing, turning it this way, that way. So he cast about. And you can see the as and the so. Next slide, please. Homer takes the abstract, Odysseus's rage, and likens it to the most familiar, a cook cooking a sausage, with the double effect of the sausage also sizzling. So it kind of has this multiple kind of dimensional aspect to it, that he's intent, but also the sausages are sizzling and they're tossing back and forth, and that's how it's describing it all. And you can hear them and you can smell them, so Homer is using lots of senses, in this word image that he gives us. Uh, we all probably know cooking, and we know the visceral effects, smells, sounds, and the sight of a sausage rolling back and forth in a skillet. It's a full body experience that Homer is tapping into, employing all the senses. You can practically taste it now. So allow me now to pivot to a prominent horse in classical literature. While Homer alludes to the story of the Trojan horse in the Odyssey, books 4, line 1, 305, and 12, line 596, the trove of details is really found in Virgil's Aeneid, book 2, lines 17 to 27. Next slide, please. Ground down by the war and driven back by fate, the Greek captains had watched the years slip by until, helped by Minerva's superhuman skill, they built that mammoth horse, immense as a mountain, lining its ribs with ship timbers hewn from pine, and offering to secure safe passage home, or so they pretend. And the story spreads through Troy. But they pick by lot the best, most able-bodied men, and stealthily lock them into the horse's dark flanks, till the vast hold of the monster's womb is packed with soldiers' bristling weapons. Next slide. The horse is an offering to replace the looted temple horse statues of Athena, Minerva in the Aeneid. In the story, according to Sinon, in response to the interrogation by Priam, who asks, next slide, why did they raise up this giant, monstrous horse? Who conceived it? What's it for? Its purpose? A gift to the gods? A great engine of battle? Virgil writes, some gaze wonderstruck at the gift for Pallas, the virgin never wed, transfixed by the horse, its looming mass, our doom. Next slide. But from the moment that godless Diomedes, flanked by Ulysses, the mastermind of crime, attacked and tore the fateful image of Pallas out of her own hallowed shrine and cut down the sentries ringing your city heights and seized that holy image and even dared touch the sacred bands on the virgin goddess's head with hands reeking blood. While many Trojans were excited to pull the gift horse inside Troy's walls, one skeptic shouted out his now famous warning. Poor doomed fools, have you gone mad, you Trojans? Trojans, never trust that horse. What it is, I fear the Greeks, especially bearing gifts. We know how the story ends. Next slide. So Calchas read the omens. At his command, they raised this horse, this effigy, all to atone for the violated image of Pallas, her wounded pride, her power, and expiate the outrage they had done. Finally, the story comes to its full climax when Sinon, stealthily loosing the pine bolts of the horse, he unleashes the Greeks, shut it up inside its womb. The horse stands open wide, fighters in high spirits, pouring out its timbered cavern into the fresh air. They steal on a city buried deep in sleep and wine. They butcher the guards, fling wide the gates, and hug their cohorts poised to combine forces. Plot complete. The story's reference to the horse concludes with the outcome. The horse stands towering high in the heart of Troy. And what a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know before I started teaching this story, is that Odysseus and before had gone in and actually destroyed the temple to Minerva or Athena, the sentinels there that are horses. And so the Trojans were more prone to allow a Trojan horse to be brought in as a kind of like an expiation, to atone for this violation of these horses. And so we have a replacement horse, at the temple. Of course, it bit them because that's how the Trojan War ultimately will come to a conclusion. All right, so now the next part of my paper is going to deal with cowboys as it relates to the Iliad as I continue to explain or illustrate my pedagogy of resemblance. Homer's epic, the Iliad, begins with a battle not between Achilles and Hector, the Greeks versus the Trojans, but instead a Greek soldier at war with his own general. Next slide, please. The epic starts. Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving toward its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. To paraphrase the beef, Agamemnon is confronted by Chryses, a priest of Apollo, who wants to retrieve his daughter back from being Agamemnon's war prize. Apollo, in his anger, has plagued the Greek forces with a fatal illness. Sounds kind of like a pandemic, doesn't it? Achilles tries to intervene, but it takes more death before Agamemnon finally, reluctantly releases the girl Chryseis back to her father. But he wants another prize as a replacement. Achilles' prize, Briseis. Achilles counters. Next slide, please. My honors never equal yours. Whenever we sack some wealthy Trojan stronghold, my arms bear the brunt of the raw, savage fighting. True, but when it comes to dividing up the plunder that I love, when I have fought to exhaustion, let's see, just lost my spot here. But when it comes to dividing up the plunder, the lion's share is yours. And back I go to my ships, clutching some scrap, some pittance that I love. When I have fought to exhaustion, no more now. So Achilles basically says to his general, if you don't pay me, I won't play. Honor in the Greek mindset isn't just an abstract word that means esteem or respect. Honor refers to physical stuff, plunder, payment for services rendered. To be dishonored means to literally be stripped of some of your stuff. The way I relate this story to my students who live just an hour and 15 minutes from where the Dallas Cowboys play, next slide, their home football games now, anyway, it's AT&T Stadium in Arlington, also known as Jerry World. It used to be Dallas Cowboys Stadium in Irving. But I tell them about the greatest running back statistically to ever play football, Emmitt Smith, and what happened during the 1993 football season. Next slide. Emmitt Smith held out for more pay because he said he wasn't being paid what he was worth as a productive running back for the successful Dallas Cowboys. He held out, and actually they had just won a Super Bowl too, so he held out by not playing any games during the preseason. No problem. The owner, Jerry Jones, surely would give him before the season's first game. He didn't. Smith sat out the first game against the then named Washington Redskins, okay, Cowboys and Indians, right? No problem. Teams had lost their first game and still had gone on to the premier game of the season, the Super Bowl. But Smith sat out in protest against their next opponent, the Buffalo Bills. Wild West, right? Also named after a famous Western star known for his killing of thousands of bison, popularly called Buffalo, right? And for his circus-like traveling show, Buffalo Bill's Wild West. In other words, Buffalo Bill Cody, right? The Cowboys lost their second game. That was too much. No team had ever lost their first two games and gone on to the Super Bowl. Jones paid Smith and signed him to a long-term contract, making him the highest paid running back in the National Football League. Next slide. That season, every game Smith played in, the Cowboys won. And every game Smith missed due to injury, the Cowboys lost. Their last game against the New York Giants was the deciding factor as to whether they were to go on to the postseason games. In that game, Smith suffered a second-degree shoulder separation, but somehow soldiered on, and the Cowboys won in overtime 16-13. Smith ran 229 total yards in that one game. In the postseason, the Cowboys won their divisional game against the Green Bay Packers 27-17. They then defeated the San Francisco 49ers 38-21 in the National Football Conference championship game. Then at the Super Bowl 28, they faced the team that had been one of their only 4 losses that season, the Buffalo Bills, which they defeated decisively 30-13. Slide, next slide. In that game, Smith was named the Super Bowl most valuable player. Next slide. That season, he ran for 1,486 rushing yards. He scored 9 touchdowns, won his 3rd rushing title, and was named the NFL MVP. In 2010, he was inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame as the running back with 164 touchdowns, 3 Super Bowls, and the league's all-time rushing leader title with a record-breaking 18,355 yards, which is a number that still hasn't been bested. Smith was Achilles, Jones was Agamemnon. Next slide, please. Well, I'll go ahead and start. Hi, my name is Moumini Quazi, and I teach in the Department of English and Languages. I'm a professor of languages. I'm a professor of English. He is more than a soldier, a Trojan soldier who was found being a tender father and loving husband. He's also known as a horse whisperer or a breaker of horses, or as we also call them in this region, a cowboy. Right? The last line of the Iliad is punctuated by this epithet. And so the Trojans buried Hector, breaker of horses. It's the very last line of the entire Iliad. His other epithet is a mention of his shining helmet, which I've already alluded to, which is topped by a horsehair crest. So let me give you one more example from Homer. The Odyssey begins with the following invocation. Next slide, please. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god wiped from sight the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus, and start from where you will. Sing for our time, too. And this is from the very first book, the first 12 lines. You don't rustle cattle, right? And that's how all of his men die. While the Odyssey centers its main narrative energy on Odysseus, the first 12 lines give away the ending of what happens to his fellow mariners. They perish after eating the forbidden cattle. My students, many of whom are from rancher families, certainly know about the culture of raising livestock, especially cows. Erath, the county where Tarleton State University is located for years, is one of Texas' top producing dairy sources. You don't mess with other people's cows, a lesson that Odysseus' men learned the hard way. We'll come back to that later. So now, next slide, please. In the style of Rushdie, I'm going to share a short story I wrote called Heartburn. And I included two quotes from the Odyssey, one translated by Robert Fagles, the same quote translated by Emily Wilson. All ways of dying are hateful to us poor mortals, true, but to die of hunger, starve to death, that's the worst of all. Eurylochus says this in the Odyssey. Here's another way of saying it. All human deaths are hard to bear, but starving is most miserable of all. Hey there, my name is Odysseus. You can call me Odie for short. I told them before I went off to have some time alone, don't any of the cattle on this ranch. I said, don't forget what happened the last time we ate livestock on a stranger's ranch. We ended up stuck in a cave with a one-eyed madman who wouldn't let us out. Mind you, we should have never eaten his cheese and made ourselves at home while he was gone. But that's another story. When he got back and blocked us in, we were in there so long he resorted to cannibalism and actually killed old Cletus and Ernie, Ridge and Troy, and finally Harvey and Joe. It was awful. You'd have thought they would have learned not to be controlled by their gut. At least the four who survived should have told what they saw, but they just couldn't convey the horror of it. So when all the food ran out, I guess they just couldn't help themselves, the fools. I warned them, don't eat the longhorns. They're like beloved mascots of a university. Just don't do it. Eat anything else. But they didn't. Instead, they got on their horses and cut off the finest cattle of the herd. It was strange how cloudy it was that day, almost on the verge of raining, but strangely overcast, like the sun was nowhere to be seen. My men, idiots that they were, pretty much slaughtered the finest of the herd. Our cooks went right to work butchering the cows and skinning them. They put the hides on makeshift fences and hung the beef on long stakes. Later, the meat was butchered and laid out on long slabs. The flat fires were hot and ready. The smokers were prepared and ready. A dry rub was mixed and applied to the meat, and the meat was placed in the smokers' grills and spits. It was quite a scene, I've been told. When the meal was finally ready, the cowboys dug in like they had never eaten before. Their barbecue tasted as good as they had ever had. They couldn't recall eating better brisket, ribs, and steaks. The only sound you could hear as they were eaten was smacking, gulping, and the clatter of forks and knives against their metal plates. After a while, the forks were tossed aside and the guys just grabbed the meat in their hands and stuffed their faces like they were wild animals. Some habits are hard to break, apparently, even after those etiquette lessons they took when they stayed at the CRC B&B a few stops before we hit this ranch. By now, I was back at the camp. I scented the air. It smelled wonderful, but it shouldn't have. I saw immediately the horrible thing that they had done. I could see the spits on the fire, could smell the unctuousness in the air. But worse than that, I could hear the words of Tai and Circe haunt me. Don't eat the cattle of the sun, or you'll call down the wrath of the great rancher in the sky. I ordered them to immediately board our ship and set sail at once, hoping to gods nobody would notice my boy's royal screw-up. We pushed off and made for the open seas, and once there, my men were seized by the unmistakable pull of an oncoming meat coma. With images replaying their memories of empty plate and large piles of ribs and bones stripped bare, they felt the drowsiness come up upon them they hadn't ever felt before. As they drifted off, they could hear the lowing of the cows in their dreams, the low moan of the longhorn softly at first, but louder and louder. In their dreams, on top of the mooing, they saw the leather skins start to move off the racks. Slowly, they began to crawl along the ground as if they were searching for their bodies. In their dreams, the cowboys saw the bones and the uncooked meat on the spits that were prepared as reserves, and the cooked meats that hadn't yet been eaten start to jiggle and jump imperceptibly at first, but then most certainly across the butcher tables and counters and dining tables. The lowing became more and more desperate and swelled into a crescendo of pain, confusion, and terror. In their dreams, the cowboys watched in horror as the cattle sought to reform and become whole again, the bones reattaching, the sinews reconnecting, the meat returning to their forms, and the skins resuming their covering. More terrifying, though, the cowboys dreamt that their stomachs began to grumble. Their bellies started to cramp and rumble. They let out quiet burps, then louder ones that preceded tides of nausea that caused them to jump up from their seats and lurch from their tables to clear the camp. In waves and waves, the cowboys began vomiting from both ends of their bodies, spewing chunks of undigested meat. There were ribs. There were uneaten steaks projecting from their mouths. There were entire pieces of brisket shooting out their backsides. Worse, though, the various cuts of meat began to squirm their way out of the cowboys' stomachs, through their intestines, and finally out their bellies, in a frenzy of desperate screams and bewildered pandemonium as they heaved their guts overboard like a human Charybdis. Even the sea seemed to lurch and gurgle and belch. The cowboys were struck down by the worst food poisoning they had ever known, until one by one, they couldn't evict any more beef, bile, blood, or guts. What was left of the cowboys lay squirming in the water, jerking helplessly. What was left of the cowboys lay squirming in the water, jerking helplessly. The scene was gruesome, yet as if from a psychedelic fever dream, the nightmare intensified as all the various pieces of meat, bone, and skin reattached before their very eyes, all while the bawling of cattle rose to a deafening pitch. But it was no dream. I was mesmerized and horrified to see the most mysterious and disgusting herd of cattle I've ever seen as their shapes began to reconfigure. In the end, the cattle were whole again. They washed ashore, but my cowboys had died. Good old Yuri was wrong. Before all this happened, he had said that dying from hunger was the worst way to die. On the ranch of the Sacred Cow, though, Odie's cowboys discovered an even worse one. Thank you. Next slide. All right. Thank you very much for helping. And my little short stories in this little book.